Yeah, so hello. Thank you for having me here again this year. Thank you, Sands. Thank you for all coming to listen. Today we'll be talking about breaching the depths of the abyss, exposing rootkits and bootkits. This has been an interesting journey for me. Last year I presented on rootkits, drivers, and since then we published the Living Off the Land Drivers project, which we'll cover in more detail. And then we'll also dive into our next project that we just released today. So my name is Michael Haig. I'm a principal threat researcher here at Splunk, and I'm on the threat research team. My focus is typically on emerging threats and how to help the community in identifying them. In addition, I'm the co-founder and maintainer of Atomic Red team and obviously the Lowell Drivers project. You can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, just Michael Haig. And then I did have a co-presenter, Jose Hernandez, who's not able to make it today, but he is a distinguished engineer at Lacework. All right, we have a ton of content to get through, so let's go ahead and jump in. My favorite part about this agenda is like, oh yeah, 5 bullet points. It's about a mile deep, and so I hope that we can get into enough of these, and this showcases a lot of the problem and the whys, why we went after these things. So let's hop in. So first, I'm going to kind of focus on the driver side. Talked about this last year. The problem here is that hunting drivers as a defender, as Windows rootkits, it's extremely hard to find a true malicious driver. It's an extreme high volume thing to go through. The reward is extremely low. You could dig through thousands of drivers across a 50,000 endpoint fleet, and maybe one, if you're lucky, you'll actually be able to identify it as either being vulnerable or an actor created malicious driver that they brought in. So it's extremely difficult in that sense to just say or pinpoint one that's bad or good. And determining whether they're good or bad, it can be really hard. And I've seen over the years, a legitimate driver can look like, as much as it'll say like the company name of Broadcom, and they'll have a new version of their driver that says Broadcom with a period at the end. And so there's so many nuances to when you're digging through drivers. There's so many nuances to understanding, all the different signing information and all just the metadata and everything like that. How do you know which ones are good or bad? And so as we're trending along in the last year, 2-3 years, we're starting to see vulnerable drivers in the past come back and be used in like mass breaches or really big breaches, and APTs or any kind of like big nation state adversary is either bringing in what we call bring your own vulnerable driver, a known bad one that can be exploited, or they will find a loophole and a way to get their driver signed and use that in a big compromise. This year alone, we've seen quite a bit. It's been, I don't know, I think it's been eye-opening, and I hope that with our project, with Lowell drivers, that everyone's able to kind of see like, yeah, drivers are a really big problem. And so that's kind of where this all is coming from. And so probably my biggest question out of it has always been like, what does this actually buy an adversary? Because it's the weird running joke is, well, they're already administrator, they're already sitting on disk. Like, why would they load up a driver to do anything else? We've seen in a couple cases recently that it's weird that they're already admin, why a driver? But the big why is there's a couple pieces: persistence and defense evasion. We've seen a couple things pop up, I'll show in a minute, where they're meant to disable and remove all kinds of, all the main critical controls that we have in place: antivirus, HVCI, anything that would prevent this driver. But that's also the hard part, is antivirus products don't typically prevent a vulnerable driver from running. So I have a vulnerable driver sitting in my fleet that is actually needed because we use this particular software, but it's also something that could be used against me to persist or be exploited and evade all my controls. It's a really, really tricky problem. And then also it's hard to detect. At the time before living off the land drivers, that project came out, before we had really pushed it, there were, I don't know, maybe 6 different repos on GitHub of vulnerable drivers, and they were all different. They had all different kinds, they have different file versions and everything like that. So it wasn't like you could just go and grab this list and say, yay or nay, I have this or not. So inventorying was really tricky. But over time, in the last couple of years with Windows 11 and everything, it's getting better on the Windows side. Something we were able to help out with, talk about as well, between Windows 11 and Defender, they have a Microsoft Windows driver block list that will block a good majority of the drivers in our project. And HVCI does help prevent a lot of these as well. And HVCI is the Hypervisor Protected Code Integrity. So it helps prevent a lot of these from getting into the kernel and persisting or being able to disable things. Recent Twitter space from the Elastic team, the word he used was, it's tricky. And it really resonates because hunting drivers, finding bad ones and all that is very, very tricky. And I like the way he said it. So if you haven't heard of the Lol Drivers project, living off the land drivers, it is a giant curated list of all the known evil drivers out there that we were able to collect. It's a heavy work in progress, but within the project, we do have a lot of detection. We have automated Sigma rules generated. We have Sysmon rules. We have Yara. And then on the prevention side, we have a custom WDAC prevent policy that is inspirational, I guess, more than anything. There is I guess that's meant to say Sysmon prevent rule or file that you could implement as well. And then we recently just added ClamAV hash database. The project itself does host over 1,200 drivers, all vulnerable or malicious. So if we're able to get the driver for a particular one that's out there, we'll add it to the project. And then on top of it all, it has complete enrichment. And I'll show you what that looks like, because it's a lot. In the midst of it all, we wanted to make it to where anybody could grab it in whatever method. So there is an API. You can grab a CSV or through JSON. You can ingest it however you want. And again, there's Sigma, there's Sysmon, and then there's Yara rules. We generate Yara every release. The Sigma and Sysmon files are generated every time a new PR comes through. So it's always fresh. And then over time, we've seen the community share different Lol driver scanners. And so if you really wanted to, you could run, there's multiple PowerShell scanners. I think someone actually wrote a client as well. It's in our release blog. But the idea is that you could pull this down and you can have it scanned kind of like the standard directories using the JSON file. And so you can just kind of continuously look for potentially vulnerable drivers in your environment. If you're pulling in the CSV or the JSON to like a SIM, you can then, of course, look for, as long as you're collecting the data, then you could then, of course, look for anything that is standing out there as well within a large set of the SIM data. So the quick walkthrough is if you go to loldrivers.io and you click on a driver, what are you going to see, right? So the quick piece here is we have the driver name at the top, and that can obviously be anything depending upon how the adversary named it or how a vulnerable driver was written and saved. Potentially might be like the original file name. Just depends on how we imported it and brought it in. And so we have a description. Every driver has a unique UID, the created date and all that. And as I mentioned, you can download the driver by just clicking the button, test it out. Maybe you want to check your AV and see if it works. And then we pass a very simple command here that just does, service create to, if you wanted to actually add it and just see if it works or not, you can do that as well. Just kind of a standard canned config there. Then as you scroll down a page of a driver, we actually added these to where you can click the little drop downs for the Yara, the Sigma, and the Sysmon. And you could just click on, hey, I want to see all the Yaras or the Sigma rules or Sysmon. All of it's here. We do generate, I think it's 3 different Yara configs. So there's a ton of enrichment if you're using Yara out there. Same with Sigma. We do have a couple Sigma rules and Sysmon. And then as you get down, I mentioned all the enrichment. It doesn't show well on a slide, but as you're looking at it, you'll see we have kind of from the top, the file name. We do provide all the hashes. If you click any of these, whether it's authentic hash or the rich PE header hash, the standard MD5 at the top for the file, the driver, it will take you right to VirusTotal in the search, and it will attempt to, as long as you're logged in, it'll attempt to use like the rich PE header hash or authentic hash, and you may end up finding there's more out there that match this. Or if you click the standard MD5, you'll see just this particular sample. And at the bottom, we dump out all of the, go back, sorry, I thought there was more. We do dump out these certificates, any imports, any exports, all the functions that it performs, and all the signature. All this data comes down in our JSON file. And I just checked this week, it's like 20 megs of JSON data. So it's ginormous. All right. So kind of switching gears, like how does LOL drivers help me? What's, this is super cool, a ton of data, but like, how can it help me? So I mentioned all the API and all the different rules and everything. Call this like rapid response. So recently, this was May 31st, there was an article, there was this new thing called Terminator, antivirus killer. It's using a vulnerable driver. And this one in particular is using a driver that we already had in the project. It was called Zamguard. So just one more way, if you're pulling it in either to your SIM or EDR, or you're enriching things with the project, you'll kind of have visibility into these things quickly, which is really cool. The next rapid response was related to this Gmer anti-rootkit driver. So it's actually kind of strange. It's a vulnerable anti-rootkit driver that allows for obviously privilege escalation. And what we saw was this tweet came out and it was, hey, this person is selling a AV killer. He wants thousands of dollars, $1,500 for the first 5, $3,000 after that. Well, once it came out, it was actually just using the Gmer driver, which of course we had in the project because this driver has been around for a while, which ended up being what's called blackout. And then another variation came out as called being NIM blackout. So all of this is in the project. Just a really cool way to see, like, if I was getting this today, inventorying my drivers somehow, we could use this to perform, response on drivers in my environment. How are we going to handle vulnerable drivers? They're probably out there. How do we find them? How do we respond to it? So my last rapid response came pretty recently. I think this is like one of the coolest use cases. Talos released a blog on an undocumented driver called Red Driver. And I think there was like 6 or 8 of them that were released with the blog itself. And this one was a really interesting case. It was not in the LOL drivers project, but within 24 hours, we were able to get it in the project. So the blog was out the 11th, and then we created all the pages and everything like that, and got the samples uploaded on July 12th. So within 24 hours, we were able to quickly, produce all this, get it out, and be able to help people, again, through the API and everything like that, or even just showcase it. We consider these malicious drivers. There's a difference between vulnerable and malicious. Vulnerables, the ones that's meant, whether unbeknownst is a very vulnerable driver, where malicious is something an adversary created. In this case, they actually found a loophole in the driver signing process from Microsoft, and they were actually able to get these signed and like ran, which is mind-blowing, because you would think the process is very tight and you wouldn't run into these types of things. So from there, going to switch gears a smidge to what we talked about a little bit last time on driver inventorying, and look at just like source and prevalence. I'm using Sysmon in all these cases and just Splunk. You can use these pretty much same kind of query in most any like logging platform or whatnot. In this case, as like an inventory method or a way to track driver loads, event code or event ID 6 in Sysmon is what we call driver load. And driver load literally will dump out every time a driver is loaded. It does produce some metadata, whether it was signed, if it has a signature, if it was verified, and if it actually exists. On the left, these drivers I'm playing with, the top one, that Dell driver, is a vulnerable Dell driver, and these bottom ones, the combo 2, combo 12, those are the Capcom drivers. It's a vulnerable driver. Yeah, see right there the names. But so they're still loading. This is a server 2019 box, I think. Yeah. So that's just kind of like one way to go and look. If you're collecting it, say an EDR has it, again, you can look at it from an EDR perspective of like, hey, what drivers are residing on my endpoints? And a lot of EDRs will tell you, where these things are. There should be in the standard directory, system 32 drivers. Sometimes they leak out into other paths, which we've seen time and time again. Another thing you can do is similar to this, where I took the event ID 6 again, and I implemented the LOL drivers CSV file, and I just said, hey, look for the name in my data set, and simple mapping, again, just telling me where it was loaded, and then have a driver description next to it. Just like a very quick way to get a win out of all that data that you may be collecting in your SIM, just to kind of show like, what's out there in my fleet. From the project itself, being that it does have all the vulnerable drivers and malicious in there. And then something else I created recently at Splunk, it's meant to help with driver inventory. You could use something like Velociraptor, any kind of tools out there, Sysmon, obviously, OS Query to query your fleet for drivers if it's on Windows. When I started thinking about it, I was like, Windows has this driver query utility. What if we Splunk it? And so I did. I was able to figure out simply by putting in this particular command, scripted input into the inputs.conf, I could have it run daily driver queries against whatever amount of endpoints and just collect this data. And so on the right-hand side is literally just my machine and then all the drivers that are on there. Doesn't produce the hash, but it does produce all the names and paths and all the ones that should be loaded up on the box. So it's a way to do inventory. If there's a lot across your fleet, it's going to be noisy, but you could stack based on prevalence and understand when a driver's on, 5 machines or 1 machine, there will be a lot that obviously add up where most machines have the same driver. So you may get lucky, but you might get lucky in finding a bad one. And another thing we've produced over time is it's kind of a simple driver dashboard. You can use this kind of as a way to say like, oh, I'm looking for new like .sys files being written to disk. Like, why is it coming in? Why is it on my disk? Why? Even like a service create of a new kernel driver happening in my environment. It probably doesn't happen every day, especially when it's a kernel driver. Who's adding it? Where's the path? Where did it come from? Everything like that. You can start to scrutinize these things at scale. So just very easy ways to kind of dig into these things. And most organizations probably spend more time on the auditing side of drivers, because if you mess with one, you prevent it, it will have, you'll have a really bad day, right? Like, you're preventing a driver from loading, therefore an application will no longer run. So there's a lot of auditing that can be enabled. Inventorying is probably your fastest way to just understand what's happening out there. You can audit with Windows attack surface reduction rules. There is a driver load one. So you can track that within those logs. Using Secure Boot, that seems like a no-brainer. We'll talk about it in a minute, but Secure Boot is meant to only allow signed drivers and whatnot to load. Obviously, driver signing enforcements here. There are the more heavy-handed on the prevent side of using something like an application control product or even WDAC, saying prevent everything and only allow, the critical drivers and whatnot that I approve of. So if you have a solid golden image and you never install anything else, a really good app control product or WDAC might be your way. And then ensuring HVCI is enabled. Like I mentioned, there is a good majority of vulnerable drivers in the LOL drivers project that are prevented. But Not all of them. I think it was about 60% were prevented based on some tests that we've seen. Okay, so on to the next one. I put in my notes, let's start the real fire. The next few slides are a little text heavy. I decided I'm not just going to read all the text. I'm going to kind of tell a story on bootloaders and bootkits. And so earlier this year, there was a report that came out from ESET on this one called Black Lotus UEFI bootkit. It really intrigued me, and there was a lot to it, these stages and just everything it did and all these different things. And I was like, I've never heard of bootkits. I've never really dug into them. I've probably heard of them. I've never really dug into bootloaders. It was totally new to me. And so from then on, it's been a wild ride. The high level items on Black Lotus, the idea was to infect the bootloader, get in there and, persist. But it also went and disabled, it's mind-blowing to say it, it disabled BitLocker, HVCI, Windows Defender. It just removed everything. And it's like, wow, like this is crazy. Not only is it disabling all the mechanisms and tools for monitoring and control, it's also going to persist even when you reboot it, beyond rebooting it, right? This is next level. And I'm like, this is where I want to dig into. This is a really interesting space. And so what's a bootloader? What's a bootkit? So the high level of all of this is that a bootloader is the piece that is going to start, it preloads the kernel, right? It's before the kernel gets loaded into memory. That's probably the simplest way. A bootkit is something that replaces the legitimate bootloader on the system. It replaces it. The real bootloader is probably there on disk. It's just this new one slid in and took over and is now being booted up. Bootloaders are cross-platform. It's going to, you'll find bootloaders on Linux, Mac. It's not like this is just a Windows thing. For me, I haven't dug into the Linux side yet. It's a whole new world. Like this is like next level stuff. This is where, I'm not saying this is where adversaries are going, but this is definitely where adversaries have been and where they are definitely looking. And for me, that's why the Black Lotus one was really interesting, because it just came in, disables everything, and just runs the world and has full permissions on the box and persisting at a whole new level. Very high level again, bootloader, right? It literally loads before, it will load everything before post and all that. So it's such a very, very low level place. It's beyond even a driver at this point, right? This is kind of just one of those locations that as a defender, we don't really see enough in when you're looking at, say, like an EDR product. I was talking to someone earlier about it. It's like, how would you detect Black Lotus if it wasn't just, if it didn't disable all the controls and whatnot? Like, how do we know a new bootloader was implemented on my system? And I'm like, and to me, I'm just like, man, that's next level. I don't even know. Like, if someone replaces my bootloader and it's starting to boot up and the OS still boots, everything works, I don't know. It's before the OS even occurs. It's before even security tools are enabled. And if it's Black Lotus, I don't even know it's there, right? All my tools have been disabled. It's weird. And then as defenders, like as an organization defender, we have to start to look at this like drivers are hard, but bootloaders are next level. It's a total different place for us to even think about from detection. And I mentioned like EDR or even like a SIM. Like if you're just dumping a bunch of data in a SIM, Windows event logs and things, if nothing's telling you that your bootloader was replaced, how do we know? And so I really want to kind of highlight that. It's like, how do we detect something that we never really see drop to like the C drive? It's not on my C drive. It doesn't just go to C Windows temp or program data. Like it's a total different place. And so that's why I really want to highlight, like as a defender, where am I going to look for these behaviors outside of things being disabled? Like how does a bootloader get there and why is it on my disk? It's just so strange. And and as I was diving into this, and a lot of this new project that I'll highlight here in a second highlights or relies on, and bootloaders in general rely on UEFI, which is basically our replacement for the old school BIOS firmware stuff. And UEFI provides, this avenue to kind of like be on firmware and to persist. And so between UEFI and Secure Boot says you are approved to run on this machine, and UEFI says, okay, I will hold that. These are the keys to the kingdom. If you've ever messed with like TPM or BitLocker, it's typically relying on Secure Boot and UEFI. That's kind of like its little under like nature work there. It's meant to not, Secure Boot is meant to only allow trusted bootloaders to load. And something that was really interesting to me for Black Lotus is there's this thing called UEFI revocation list. And I think there's another way to pronounce it, is the UEFI revocation list. This revocation list comes out every so often when a bad malicious bootloader gets found. They can revoke it from those keys. It comes out in a little file. It's called the DBX file. Microsoft will push updates, Ubuntu and everybody will push their updates. And it's meant to update this DBX and revoke those bootloaders, these now bad bootloaders. Well, the crazy thing is with Black Lotus is ESET said that it looks to have hit the market around October 2022. They dropped their blog around March, early March. And that's when it kind of got real heavy in the news. Well, UEFI didn't revoke it until May. And Microsoft didn't push a patch, I think, until April. And the patch was very heavy. You had to do some manual labor on it. But this left systems vulnerable to Black Lotus for about 7 months. It was never revoked. It was never been patched. Like, this was really out there. And like that impact of something like this it's big. And so what we ended up doing, or as far as my research went, I started digging into the revocation list, how many of these are out there. And it's a giant list. When Black Lotus was banned or revoked, the list went, I think, from like 400 something to like 520. The spreadsheet just like erupted. But it contains all the hashes. It contains the CVEs, the vendor names, when it was added, and all that. And so when I started digging into it, I wrote a tool to just start to mess with bootloaders and the Windows bootloader in particular. This is released. I have it out there now, my repo. And then anything else I mention here, I also will share on my repo within the same place here. But so as defenders, how can we learn more about bootkits and loaders? I created this simple tool. I was digging into another bootloader called LoadJax. You might remember it. It's kind of old. A pretty big adversary used it, APT28, Fancy Bear, Sednet Group. ESET said again that this was probably the first UEFI rootkit found in the wild, especially being used by a pretty large adversary. One of the things that they performed when modifying the bootloader was there's these registry keys, and it's under boot execute. It's in the script. I guess I didn't put that in my notes. But the idea is that all the adversary did is they put their new bootloader, their malicious bootkit, inside the like hidden partition where they live, and then they modified the registry to say, don't look for the default, which in this case for me on my machine was auto check, auto chk, and then a little asterisk. They modified that to just say auto che, and that's it. And in my head, I was like, man, that's wild. Like, to think that it was simple enough. They replaced the bootloader, they modified the registry, you reboot the machine, and now it's the adversary controlled box at that point. Like, it's totally compromised. And so this little tool is meant to just help with kind of highlighting and showing how to easily kind of quickly modify the registry. And then on the right-hand side is something that happens when you mess with your bootloaders. And so during my testing on a Windows 11 machine, I was adding and playing with just the configuration and everything, really messing my machine up. And eventually it prompted me and said, which one do you want to use? And I'm like, oh, you're right. I've modified this enough times that you probably don't like it anymore. So with all of that, UEFI revocation, bootloaders, Black Lotus, all these interesting things, we're releasing a new project called bootloaders.io. It's live. I guess the color scheme has changed. The site's a little different than our can slide right now. But you can hit there now. And we have first pushed out the 520 batch from the revocation list. You can now kind of click through, see the bootloaders. If you want to download one, we do have about, I think, 127 of them in the project, the revoked ones, if you want to play with it. I also have the command in there to perform BCD edit and modify your Windows host. The Linux side will be working to enhance more. There is an API. We do have Yarrow rules, very similar to LOL drivers. So we're able to kind of replicate a lot of what we've already created. But this time we're focused on the bootloader side. Now that the project's out, revocation list is kind of already added. We will begin to add all the prior knowns of the malicious bootkits that are out there, just to keep enhancing this project. So really excited about it. Raise awareness. You know, a great place to learn about bootloaders and bootkits, what's out there, and help defenders start to think about something that's extremely complex, you know, and start to maybe put strategies in place, you know, ask questions to vendors like, what are you doing about bootkits? I don't ever want that question. And then something I've created here at Splunk, again, related to like an inventory. There is BCD edit on a Windows machine. Linux is a little bit different. You can query them and find all your bootloaders running on your machine. And so in my case, which I had a lot, I just ran BCD edit on the right-hand side, and it will just, you know, output everything. And you can see there's the second one in here called atomic boots. And there probably is a path, which typically, actually, I don't think it shows path usually, but it will. If you do modify, you can add the path in here to your new location. And so again, I use what's called a scripted PowerShell, a scripted input in Splunk, where I just have it run BCD edit enum. And if you were to run this across your fleet, you'll start collecting bootloaders and maybe find some strange ones out there. Yeah, so big shout out. This book has been around, but it's extremely resourceful. The website's bootkits.io, and it might be a lot more in the weeds. It does reverse bootkits and rootkits. So if you're looking at drivers and bootloaders, this is a good book to go and dig into and really understand. Again, it's bootkits.io. Alex is pretty active on Twitter as well. You might find all three of them on Twitter, but you'll be able to kind of see, you know, what they're digging into now and everything like that as well. But yeah, very powerful. So kind of the main high key takeaways: load drivers, bootloaders, they're all here to help you and to help you advance your programs. Look to utilize detections and preventions from the project, even if it's as much as just the API and pulling it into a product and reviewing or enriching your current set of anything. That's what it's here for. Detection will be very tricky for both of these. It's very voluminous. It's very hard for bootloaders, but hopefully we can start to add more out there publicly, and everybody can, like, you know, learn from this and begin to do better and understand these a lot more. Think outside the box for inventory. When I was looking to inventory drivers and then now bootloaders, it's one of these things where we just have to, like, you know, there's no Windows event log. It's not going to save me anymore. Like, I need to go and, like, how do I get these? How do I pull them from something? And, you know, just to better understand what is in my fleet. And yeah, begin investigating how to integrate any and all of this with your security stack. Oh, and yeah, if you want to hit the next slide, that is the end. But yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you.